Hi, class. It's Pamela Lewis, your instructor for 2D design, and today I'm going to be talking to you about line, L-I-N-E, yes, line, our first element of design, element of art, principles of design. Basically, we're going to be looking at what the building blocks of making and understanding visual works. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and go through a little PowerPoint with you to start. Okay, so here we go. So, all right. Just getting started. Okay, so line. Here we go. How to talk about it. Let's look at some lines. Line is one of the visual design elements in art. It can be a point in motion or a series of adjacent points or a connection between points or an implied connection between points. So we're going to look at those different kinds of lines that we do understand visually, but maybe we don't name them to ourselves a lot. Here is a series of Picasso drawings, and you can see a long, sinuous, right, line, curving, but very simple, but describing complex and lovely things. This is a denser series of marks. William Kintridge, a South African artist. He makes films and does performances and creates operas, but he also does charcoal and pastel and colored pencil drawings, which he then turns into stop motion animation. And so this is one of his images, and you can see all kinds of marks and lines in there. Here's an actual line, people lined up to go into those doors. But if you think of each head of each person as a point that is adjacent to another point, you can follow along that line and draw one, right? If you were to connect the dots, if each dot was a head, you'd have a jittery line that would move right out into space. So not only are people lining up, they're creating a visual line, either of their bodies, or if you look at where their feet meet the ground, or where their heads differentiate from the background there, you can see a line in that way as well. Up in the sky, we have power lines very often. I still have them in my neighborhood anyway. So here's some lovely lines between points. In these paintings, the line is an implied one. You can see lots of lines that the artist painted within, certainly, but the lines I want to talk to you about are implied lines. So in this case, the artist would use figures very often to help them tell the story, biblical or mythological, and where the figures are looking in the image is a way for us as the viewers to be moved through the image as well. So the image with two figures in it, one playing a flute, the standing figure is looking down at the ground and sort of watching perhaps the flute player looking just beyond them. So when we look at that taller figure, we're drawn to them first because of their placement in the painting. We immediately look to see what they are looking at, right? And the birds in the sky overhead are also pointing in that direction. And so that helps tell the narrative and the story in the order that the artist would like. And the other painting with several figures and three distinct layers, you could see the bottom figures, the two central figures are looking up, and which brings us up to the Mary figure, who is also looking up, to the male figure in the top, who's then looking down. And so it creates this sort of reciprocity of shared glances. Some of the little angels are looking down, some are looking up. The two figures on the outside on the bottom are looking out of the image. And so as we study this painting and sort of move around it with our eyes, as we catch the eye of the different figures, it's our instinct to sort of look at what they're looking at. Just like if you're, walking down the street and someone is pointing at something, you'll look to see what they're pointing at. Just natural curiosity. And so in that way, those are implied lines. There's not actually kind of like laser beams coming out of their eyes directing you where to look, but the implication is that you look in the direction that they are looking. Here's a bunch of points, right, or polka dots rather, in alignment. You see diagonal lines made up of points. You see a strong vertical line right in the center where it looks like these points smash into each other, and that's perspective on those circles. Those ellipses get very thin in the middle and make a line that also looks like it recedes from us. It's almost like we're looking at a book that's laying on the table with its pages open, and that's the spine of the book. But of course, this is a flat surface with flat shapes. All of any kind of volume or movement deeper or out or away is created by the juxtaposition of these points and the lines. Also, you'll notice some of the circles are a light gray, and those also, tone can also change how we view something. So they appear to be closer to us than the darker ones. This is a mixed media work. It looks like sort of like a weaving. You see lots of curving lines kind of waving down the center there, and then lighter gray lines around the edges, and then the heavy black kind of snakish outline there. And you can see a texture to them, but it definitely looks like lines. As you move in closer, you'll see that those lines are actually created by not only points, but little push pins, right? And as we get closer, the illusion of the line might break down a bit. But you can still see it, and closer still, it's a little bit harder to hold on to the lines per se. You start seeing the individual points more. Line orientation, how line relates to the page. Horizontal lines, those go straight across, left to right. Vertical lines, up and down. Diagonal lines, from corner to corner, and curved lines, right? Moving in sort of rounded forms. Diagonal and curved lines are the most dynamic, meaning they suggest movement. Here's a Sol LeWitt drawing, a couple of wall drawings, and these lines are primarily vertical and horizontal. There are some diagonal lines on this side here, and those do feel a little more active than the others, but these lines look like stacks, right? Careful stacks and arrangements of lines. I don't, for one, get a sense of movement so much as I get a sense of structure or wall or building. Like this could almost be like big bricks or something. And so it feels stable and solid visually, but I don't get a sense of movement. This one, to me, another Sol LeWitt drawing, has a lot of color, which of course activates the space, but also all the lines curve and move over each other. And so that really gives a sense of sort of undulating movement. Now this Bridget Riley, another op art piece, the longer you look at it, the more it starts sort of wiggling and moving and actually shifting to kind of red tones from black and white. And that's all what she was interested in terms of optical illusions. And please look away if it like turns your stomach. But really, those are just curving lines that are adjacent to each other. But it was how close they are to each other and just how they curve that creates that active visual illusion. Here's zigzag lines, thick lines, thin lines. Line can give an impression of movement, right? It actually, with the op art, it actually makes my eyes move. But here, this is Julien Miratou, and it looks like an explosion or a tornado or a whirlwind, all these curving jumble of lines. Julie Meritus has worked a lot with images from architecture and architectural plans. And so if you look closely at some of her works, you'll see, you know, windows and doors and archways and bits of buildings and things like that. In this case, you see sort of the little flag shapes that fly over car dealerships or maybe, you know, sporting events, and the sort of curving lines suggest to me like a curved amphitheater or stadium here. But you see dash lines and broken lines and thick lines and thin lines and dense lines and airy ones. And so you can see that by layering all these different lines, you get a real sense of movement here. Here's a simpler drawing in just the blacks and whites so that you can see the thick, the thin, the hatch marks, which are lines that are parallel to one another. What's the purpose of a line? A line might define a shape. Say you needed to draw a square, right? You pick up a pencil, you would draw those 4 straight lines to make your square shape. So that would define the edge of that shape. It also can define contours or form. So form is a 3-dimensional object. And so if you need to define a 3-dimensional object on a 2-dimensional form, like a page or a screen for that matter, and you want it to look 3D, you can use line and how they curve and the contours of objects to suggest that 3-dimensionality. They can be subtly implied by the composition. Composition is the arrangement of elements. So perhaps you won't have drawn a line, but 2 variant colors will block up into each other, and that will create a line. For example, the horizon line, when you look out at the ocean, where the ocean meets the land, there's not really a line drawn on there, but it's the difference between the color of the sky and the color of the land that creates that horizon line. And they can convey a mood or a feeling, right? Fast, whipping, turning, swirling lines, as opposed to careful, thin and elegant lines can relay different kinds of information. So here's a cross contour line, that is lines that go define the shapes, the edges and the edge of form in 2 directions. They cross each other. And this is very schematic and kind of grid-like, but even so, you can see that at like the top of this apple where it's supposed to dip down around the stem, you really do get a sense of this little divot up there. But really that's all created by just exactly how you curve the lines and how close they are to one another. Here's cross contour lines in a drawing by Henry Moore, more like artists use them, not usually as schematic as that apple. But if you look at the arms of these figures, you'll see this sort of curving half circle line, right? That is suggesting sort of the tube of the upper arm or the forearm here or around the fingers here. And so by curving that line, you get a sense of dimensionality, where the repeated lines in the background here are vertical. They go straight up and down for the most part. And that straight up and down line suggests flatness. And so that's like the wall behind. We start understanding that is flat. Yet the arm here, because it curves around, we know that that is rounded and dimensional. And so just the shape of the lines there suggest form. In this case too, right? You can see that the parallel horizontal lines on the gray flat surface that these figures are laying on, those parallel horizontal lines make it look flat. But as the lines move over the bodies, they curve up and down, and that suggests roundness or dimension. This is a pretty flat looking figure, but a beautiful contour line around this Egon Schiele person. It's pointy little shoulders, a nice heavy line, although you can see in some places the line is much thinner, at the sternum, for example. So there is a variety of lines there. Here's an Escher and the contour lines describing the sleeves or the cuffs, and the cuff links are contoured lines, but that area looks much flatter than the hands and the fingers and the pencil, which are described with line and tone and shadow. And so that's using lots of different variety of line to get very different effects of dimensionality. Here's a Leonardo da Vinci drawing, it's a portrait, and you can see there's more lines hatching and cross-hatching in the face, which creates tone. So you have a highlight and a shadow, which gives a sense of dimension. So that cheek and the eye, the orb of the eye look very rounded. These parallel diagonal lines on the hair and shoulder, that's a hatching. That's called hatching, lines like that. And they basically create a tone or a shade to make it kind of recede a little bit, and they're really quite flat. So this moves, and then there's the contour outline of the rest of the hair that's not developed, or the bodice that's not developed. So you see a lot of different lines described in this image. There's a very dynamic Keith Kollwitz image, Death and the Mother. During war time, she made these drawings, and all the diagonal lines combined with the, frightened face really make for a very dynamic and active drawing. You can see the pointy elbows, the diagonal of the body, the diagonal of the figure behind the death figure is going opposite to the diagonal of the figure in the front. And so all of those lines pushing against each other and pulling against each other relay a lot of movement, and definitely a mood of fear there too. Here's R. Crumb. So here you can really see in this large portrait hatching and cross-hatching, the cross-hatching in the background where the little hatch marks cross each other, hatching around the neck where it's parallel lines that don't necessarily cross each other, but also kind of relay tone and value. And his neck looks like a cylinder, like a rounded shape, right? You can see the sort of around his mouth, the sort of little pooch of skin here, or the tip of his nose. It's all created by creating shadow, by using lines and hatching and cross-hatching. Here's a more cartoon, how to improve your drawing ability. And it's a caricature, so all of the features are exaggerated, the expression is exaggerated, the body is greatly simplified. And the hatching is very simplified too. There's not a lot of variety of mark, where the hatching and cross-hatching in the more naturalistic portrait, there's short lines, long lines, broken lines, hatched, cross-hatched, dotted lines. This is much more simplified, which goes along with the more simple figure as well. Calligraphic lines that both are language and picture at the same time. Incredible to look at. Oh, I skipped one. Here's a Jackson Pollock, which he's the painter that's famous for doing drip paintings. And here's a drippy drawing done either with black ink or black paint on a cream background. And you don't really find any figures or pictures within here. It's more just marks, curving, drippy marks, thin, thick. But you do get a sense of a lot of movement in there. You can kind of feel the paint dripping off the end of the paintbrush as it swirls around. And so just with these marks, one gets a sense of movement. Now here's another, this is Paul Klee, and he used thick black marks, but they're painted in a much more controlled way. And they have starting and stopping points. They're all about the same thickness, even though some are curved and some are more zigzag and angled, but they're all very carefully placed within the negative space. They're careful to not overlap or touch each other. And so it's much more arranged like a jigsaw puzzle, and you get less movement and more kind of like a tile or mosaic feeling looking at that. Keith Haring was a graffiti artist, did chalk line drawings in the subways of New York in the 80s, very famous for his activism around South Africa and divesting in South Africa, and also the AIDS epidemic and crisis in the 80s. He uses very heavy, simple lines to describe very complex issues, very emotional, and also vibrant and fun imagery, but very simply drawn. Matthew Ritchie actually makes sculptures. He paints on the walls, but he also creates these swirling lines in steel. He like welds and melts out the steel and kind of carves them. So you walk in and it's almost like a metal, I don't know, spider web, very stable, but that's in the space. And so there's many, many layers. There'll be some lines on the wall, some lines that are steel in the space, and then there's paintings on top as well. But all very rich and a lot of movement in his work too. And you see the curving lines there too, and the different widths and colors. Janine Antonin, Loving Care, a performance artist. And here she's on a large canvas and she's using her hair to paint with like a brush. So these big calligraphic marks are made with her head and her body. Judy Pfaff, this is an installation. So it looks like a scribble drawing, but it's in 3 dimensions because you walk in and those are all wires and ropes and of different widths and different colors that she's exuberantly arranged along with these discs and these weighted balls and lights in this space. So it's kind of like walking into an abstract drawing. Earth artists like Christo also uses line. In this case, Running Fence was a ginormous fence that he built through the landscape in Central California. You could see it from space, you could see it from planes. And then here's some images of what it looked up close. So how to create this sort of drawing on the earth. Spiral jetty, Robert Smithson created this jetty into this lake. And you can see it from space, this sort of ancient shape of the spiral that he created in real space, real time. Sometimes it's underwater completely and it disappears depending on the water levels, and then it arrives. And it's just amazing to see when it comes back. And here's a Richard Long, another famous earth artist who would kind of do performances outside. And in this case, he created this line. It's called A Line Made by Walking. And so you can see this line created by sort of stepping and wearing a path, a straight path in this field. And so not only do you get a sort of a geometric line in a natural space that looks very out of place there, but you also have to imagine the number of times, someone had to walk back and forth to create that path. And so, it brings up ideas about our relationship to the environment and civilization and other pathways that we might find and why they're worn, whether it's from commerce or, travel of those kinds. So anyway, so that's a bunch of lines I wanted to show you in images. by artist. And I'm going to include this recording. Of course, you'll see it on Canvas, along with other information about the principles and elements of art and design and your first line projects that you'll be doing. So look for more information on our Canvas. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. See you soon.